In a small church on the edge of a forgotten town, a child speaks words that shatter a priest's certainty. God didn't answer me. What begins as a simple confession becomes a journey into the depths of faith, doubt, and the mysterious ways grace moves through broken vessels. When Father Michael decides to act on the child's pain, rather than offer empty platitudes, he sets in motion a transformation that will test everything he believes and reveal that sometimes the divine speaks loudest through our most human moments. Stay until the end to witness how one choice can resurrect faith from the ruins of silence. If this story moves you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories that restore hope. The rain arrived without warning that November afternoon, drumming against the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church with a persistence that felt almost personal. Father Michael sat alone in the front pew, his shoulders curved forward like a question mark, his fingers tracing the worn-wood grain beneath his palms, a gesture he'd repeated so many times over the years that the surface had begun to memorize the shape of his uncertainty. The church smelled of old hymnals and melting candle wax, scents that once brought him comfort, but now seemed to underscore the emptiness of the space, the way silence has weight when you're trying not to hear your own thoughts. Through the colored glass, the world outside fractured into jeweled fragments, reds and blues and ambers that painted his hands with light that felt borrowed, temporary, like everything else he'd been clinging to lately. He had been a priest for 23 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a calling and a habit, long enough to know that faith is not a constant flame, but something that flickers, dims, threatens to extinguish when you're not watching carefully. Lately, Father Michael had stopped watching carefully. The prayers had become words without weight, syllables arranged in familiar patterns that his mouth shaped automatically while his mind wandered elsewhere, to unpaid bills, to the leak in the rectory ceiling, to the growing spaces between parishioners in the pews each Sunday. He told himself this was normal, that every servant of God passed through deserts of doubt. But the telling had become its own kind of prayer, a mantra against the creeping suspicion that he had somehow lost the thread of why he'd begun this journey in the first place. The child appeared so quietly that Father Michael didn't notice her at first. Just a small presence at the edge of his peripheral vision, standing in the aisle with rain-darkened hair clinging to her forehead and a yellow raincoat that seemed too bright for the dimness of the church. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, with eyes that held the peculiar gravity children sometimes develop when they've been forced to understand things too early. She didn't speak immediately, and neither did he, both of them suspended in that strange moment before a conversation begins, when the air is thick with unspoken things, and you can almost feel the future tilting toward you like a door slowly opening. "Father!" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the rain's percussion with surprising clarity. "Can I talk to you?" There was something in the way she asked, not with the timidity of a child seeking permission, but with the exhausted directness of someone who had already tried every other option and found them wanting. Father Michael nodded, gesturing to the pew beside him, as she came forward with footsteps that seemed too heavy for someone so small, each one leaving a faint wet print on the stone floor that would evaporate within minutes, leaving no evidence she'd been there at all. She sat down, and for a long moment, she simply stared at the altar, at the crucifix hanging above it where Christ gazed down with eyes that had witnessed every variety of human suffering and still somehow managed to look surprised by it. The child's hands were clasped in her lap, fingers twisted together in a knot that spoke of prayers already attempted, petitions already sent into the void. When she finally turned to look at Father Michael, her expression was not one of innocence or hope, but something far more dangerous. The look of someone who had measured the world and found it lacking, who had asked the universe a question and received only silence in return. "God didn't answer me," she said, and the words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that would eventually touch everything. Father Michael felt something shift in his chest when the child spoke those 4 words. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if she had given voice to the very thing he'd been trying not to say to himself for months. God didn't answer me. How many times had he thought the same thing while kneeling before the altar in the empty hours before dawn, waiting for some sign, some whisper of divine presence that never came. But hearing it from this child, seeing the raw hurt in her eyes, somehow made the admission more real, more dangerous. He cleared his throat, buying himself a few seconds to arrange his thoughts into the shape of pastoral comfort, to reach for the reassuring phrases that were supposed to work in moments like these. Sometimes, he began carefully, God's answers don't come in the way we expect. Sometimes he speaks through. No, the child interrupted him with a firmness that was startling. I know what you're going to say. My mom already said it. My teacher said it. The lady at church last week said it. But it's not true. Her voice didn't rise, but intensified, each word carefully chosen and precisely placed. I prayed every single night for 3 months. I did everything right. I was good. I helped with the dishes. I stopped fighting with my brother. I even gave my allowance to the collection plate. And God still didn't answer. Father Michael watched her as she spoke, noticing details he'd missed before. The shadows beneath her eyes that suggested too many sleepless nights. The way her shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to make herself smaller, less visible to a God who seemed to be looking elsewhere. There was a bruise on her wrist, partially hidden by the sleeve of her raincoat, a greenish-yellow mark that could have been from anything, a fall, a playground accident, but something about the way she unconsciously covered it with her other hand made Father Michael's instincts sharpen with concern. "What did you pray for?" he asked quietly, abandoning the prepared script of comfort, choosing instead to simply listen, which was sometimes the only honest thing a priest could do. The child looked down at her hands, at the tangle of fingers that had loosened slightly, but still held tension in every joint. "My dad," she said, so softly that Father Michael had to lean closer to hear her over the rain. "He's sick, really sick, not like a cold or the flu. The kind of sick where doctors use quiet voices and look at my mom like they're already sorry. I prayed every night for God to make him better. I made deals. I promised I'd never ask for anything else ever again if he would just fix my dad. But he didn't. Dad got worse. He can't even get out of bed now. And I know." Her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "I know what's going to happen. Everyone keeps saying we have to have faith, and God has a plan, but what kind of plan takes someone's dad away? What kind of answer is that?" Father Michael felt the familiar weight of pastoral responsibility settling on his shoulders, that burden every priest carries when confronted with suffering that has no easy explanation, no comforting platitude that won't ring hollow. He'd sat with dying parishioners, held the hands of grieving widows, baptized babies who would never see their first birthday, and each time, he'd reached for faith like a tool he could use to fix things, only to find it slipping through his fingers like water. The child was right. God's silence was deafening, and all the theological explanations in the world couldn't change the fact that a little girl was about to lose her father and no divine intervention was coming to stop it. "I don't know," Father Michael said finally, and the honesty of it felt like stepping off a cliff. "I don't know why God doesn't answer some prayers. I don't know why good people suffer while others seem to sail through life untouched. I've spent 23 years trying to make sense of it, and I still don't have answers that satisfy me." The child looked at him with something like surprise, as if she'd expected another round of religious reassurances and found something else instead. Truth, maybe, or at least the admission that truth was elusive. "Then what's the point?" she asked. "If God doesn't answer, if prayer doesn't work, if faith doesn't actually do anything, then what's the point of any of it?" It was the question Father Michael had been circling around for months, the one that woke him at 3 in the morning and followed him through his days like a shadow. What was the point? Why did he stand at the altar every Sunday and speak words about hope and grace and divine love when the world kept breaking people's hearts with ruthless efficiency? Why did he tell people to have faith when his own faith felt like a threadbare garment, worn thin in places where he could almost see through it to the emptiness underneath? The rain intensified, hammering against the roof with renewed fury, and somewhere in the church, a door swung open and closed with a bang that echoed through the nave like a gunshot. Neither of them flinched. They sat in their shared silence, priest and child, both grappling with the same fundamental questions that had plagued humanity since the first person looked up at an indifferent sky and asked why. "I think," Father Michael said slowly, feeling his way through the words like someone walking through a dark room, "that maybe the point isn't whether God answers our prayers the way we want. Maybe the point is what we do when the answer is silence." He paused, seeing the child's skeptical expression, and pressed on. "Your father is sick. God hasn't miraculously healed him. Those are facts. But what are you going to do with those facts? Are you going to let them make you bitter and closed off? Or are you going to love your father fiercely in whatever time you have left? Are you going to let this break you? Or are you going to let it break you open?" The child considered this, her young face taking on an expression of concentration that made her look older than her years. "But I wanted God to fix it," she said. "I wanted a miracle." "I know," Father Michael said. And he did know. He'd wanted countless miracles over the years, divine interventions that never came, prayers that seemed to evaporate the moment they left his lips. But maybe miracles aren't always about changing circumstances. Maybe sometimes they're about changing us. Even as he said it, Father Michael wondered if he believed his own words, or if he was just reciting lines from a script he'd memorized long ago. But something about the conversation was shifting things inside him, loosening calcified beliefs, allowing light into spaces that had been dark for too long. The child had come to him seeking answers, but in her honest confession of doubt, she'd somehow given him permission to examine his own. "Will you come with me?" the child asked suddenly, her eyes brightening with an idea that seemed to animate her whole body. "To see my dad? I think maybe he needs to hear what you just said. About miracles not always being about changing circumstances." Father Michael hesitated, feeling the old instinct to maintain professional boundaries, to keep his pastoral duties contained within the church walls where he could control the narrative. But something in the child's face, a desperate hope that hadn't quite been extinguished despite everything, made him nod. "Yes," he said, "I'll come." They stood together, and the child slipped her small hand into his with a trust that felt both humbling and terrifying. As they walked toward the church doors, Father Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something larger than a simple hospital visit, that the child had somehow become a guide, leading him toward a reckoning he'd been avoiding. The rain greeted them as they pushed through the heavy wooden doors, immediately soaking through his coat and plastering his hair to his skull, cold and insistent and strangely cleansing. The drive to the house took them through the older part of town, where houses sagged on their foundations and chain-link fences corralled weedy yards. The child, her name was Emma, she'd told him in the car, directed him with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every turn on the route home. She sat in the passenger seat with her yellow raincoat creating a small puddle on the upholstery, her eyes fixed on the rain-blurred streets as if reading prophecies in the streaming water. Father Michael gripped the steering wheel and tried to prepare himself for what he might find, tried to summon the pastoral presence he'd cultivated over 2 decades of ministry. But mostly he just felt like a man driving through the rain with a child who'd asked him a question he couldn't answer. Emma's house was a small ranch-style home, with peeling paint and a garden that had surrendered to autumn's decay. Flowers that had once been tended now hung their heads in defeat, their petals scattered across the muddy ground like fallen prayers. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway, its net torn and hanging by a single thread, swaying in the wind like something waiting to let go completely. Father Michael parked and turned off the engine, and for a moment, they both sat there, listening to the rain drum on the roof of the car, neither quite ready to cross the threshold into whatever waited inside. "He's not scary," Emma said suddenly, as if reading Father Michael's hesitation. "He looks different now, thinner, and his voice is weird, but he's still my dad. He still does the voices when he reads stories, when he has the energy. He still remembers all the little things, like how I take my hot chocolate with extra marshmallows and no whipped cream, because whipped cream is an abomination against cocoa. That's what he always says." She smiled slightly at the memory, and Father Michael saw in that expression both the child she still was and the adult grief was forcing her to become. They walked to the front door together, Emma's hand finding his again with that same trusting gesture that made Father Michael's throat tighten. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman who must have been Emma's mother, mid-30s but wearing exhaustion like a decade's worth of aging, eyes that had forgotten how to fully close because sleep had become something she snatched in brief intervals between crises. She looked at Father Michael with a mixture of surprise and wariness, the expression of someone who'd been visited by too many people offering hollow sympathies and not enough practical help. "Mom, this is Father Michael from St. Catherine's," Emma said quickly. "I asked him to come. Is it okay? Can he see Dad?" The woman, Sarah, she introduced herself, studied Father Michael for a long moment, and he had the distinct impression of being weighed and measured, his worth calculated in the span of a few seconds. Whatever she saw must have been acceptable, or perhaps she was simply too tired to turn away even inadequate help, because she stepped aside and gestured them in. "He's awake right now," she said. "Having a good day, relatively speaking. He'll be glad to see you, Emma." The house smelled of medication and something else Father Michael couldn't quite identify. The peculiar scent of illness, of a body slowly betraying itself, of time running out in increments too small to measure, but too real to ignore. They walked through a living room where medical equipment had displaced normal furniture, where an oxygen tank stood like a metal sentinel beside a recliner, where pill bottles colonized every flat surface in orange plastic armies. Family photos on the walls showed happier times, beach vacations, birthday parties, a wedding where Sarah wore white and the man beside her radiated health and future. Father Michael noted how the photos tracked backward in time as they walked deeper into the house. The man in the pictures growing progressively younger and more vital, as if they were walking in reverse toward the person he used to be. Emma's father lay in a hospital bed that had been set up in what must have once been a dining room. The table had been pushed against the wall, covered now with more medications, tissues, water bottles, anything that might be needed in the long vigils of caring for someone whose body was incrementally shutting down. The man in the bed looked like he'd been carved from wax, and then partially melted, skin stretched too tight over bones that had become too prominent, eyes sunk deep into hollows that made his gaze seem to come from somewhere far away. But when he saw Emma, those eyes lit up with something that defied the physical deterioration, a spark of pure love that seemed to exist independent of the failing flesh. "Hey, Butterfly," he said, his voice rough and thin but still capable of warmth. "You're home early." Emma went to him immediately, climbing carefully onto the bed beside him with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to navigate around 4 lines and monitor wires. She fit herself into the curve of his arm, and he held her with whatever strength remained, and Father Michael felt like an intruder witnessing something too intimate for outside eyes. This was the reality behind all the theological debates about suffering and divine will. Just a father holding his daughter, both of them knowing without saying that these moments were numbered, that every embrace was being cataloged in memory against the coming absence. "Dad, this is Father Michael," Emma said, looking up at her father with an expression Father Michael couldn't quite read. "I talked to him about prayers and stuff." The man's eyes found Father Michael's, and in that gaze was a complexity of emotions. Gratitude that someone was paying attention to his daughter's pain, skepticism about what a priest could possibly offer in the face of terminal illness, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he too had been asking questions in the dark and receiving only echoes. "Emma's been worried about me," the man said, and there was apology in his voice, a father's guilt at causing his child suffering despite the fact that his illness was nobody's fault. "She's been praying hard. I keep telling her she doesn't need to make deals with God, that it's not her job to fix this, but—" He trailed off, his free hand gesturing weakly at the reality that surrounded them, the medical equipment, the medications, the gradually dimming light of his life. Father Michael moved closer to the bed, pulled up a chair that scraped against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud for the hushed atmosphere of the room. He sat, and for a moment, he simply looked at this family, father, daughter, and mother hovering in the doorway, and felt the full weight of what the church had sent him out to do. He was supposed to bring comfort, offer faith, Speak words about God's plan and eternal life and the hope that transcends earthly suffering. But sitting there, watching Emma curl against her dying father, Father Michael found that all those practiced phrases died in his throat, exposed as inadequate in the face of real pain. Emma told me God didn't answer her prayers, Father Michael said finally, deciding that honesty was the only currency worth trading in this moment. And I told her I didn't know why. I told her I've spent most of my life asking the same question, and I still don't have answers that satisfy me. Emma's father looked surprised, and then something like respect crossed his features. That's not what I expected from a priest, he said. Usually you all have very neat explanations for why terrible things happen to decent people. I used to have those explanations, Father Michael admitted. I've given them countless times, all the standard theodicy arguments, all the consolations about mysterious ways and greater purposes. But lately, they've started to feel like lies. Not malicious lies, but the kind of lies we tell because the truth is too uncomfortable, too uncertain. The truth is that sometimes prayers don't get answered the way we want. Sometimes good people die young and bad people prosper. Sometimes the universe seems fundamentally unjust, and no amount of theological gymnastics can make that feel okay. Sarah had moved into the room now, standing at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed, as if holding herself together through sheer physical force. "So what's the point then?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of challenge. "If God doesn't intervene, if prayer is just talking to an empty room, why should we keep believing? Why shouldn't we just accept that we're alone in this, that there's no divine plan, just random suffering and eventual death?" It was the same question Emma had asked, but coming from Sarah, it carried the weight of adult desperation, of someone who'd been holding the pieces of her family together while watching one of them slip away despite every effort, every prayer, every bargain promise with the divine. Father Michael felt the question land on him like a physical weight, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he possessed. Because Father Michael said slowly, still feeling his way through the darkness towards something that might be true, even if God doesn't change the circumstances, even if the miracle we want doesn't come, we're still here together. We still have the capacity to love each other, to show up, to bear witness to each other's pain. Maybe that's not nothing. Maybe that's actually everything. Emma's father was quiet for a long moment, his fingers gently stroking his daughter's hair in a gesture that was both soothing to her and clearly precious to him. "I used to be angry," he said finally. "When I first got the diagnosis, I was furious with God. I lived a decent life, not perfect, but decent. I paid my taxes, helped my neighbors, loved my family. And this was the reward? Terminal illness before I even hit 40? It seemed like cosmic injustice, and I spent weeks raging against it, demanding to know why me, why my family, why now." "What changed?" Father Michael asked. "Emma did," the man said, looking down at his daughter with eyes that glistened. "One night, she came to my bedside. This was a few months ago, when I could still walk a little, and she asked me if I was scared to die. And I started to give her the brave parent answer, the reassuring lie that everything was going to be okay. But I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized she already knew the truth. She was asking because she needed me to be honest with her, to not treat her like she was too young to handle reality. So I told her yes, I was scared. Terrified, actually, not so much of death itself, but of leaving, of missing her graduation, her first heartbreak, her wedding, all the moments I wouldn't get to witness." Emma had gone very still, listening to her father speak, and Father Michael could see tears tracking silently down her cheeks, dripping on her father's hospital gown where they left small dark spots like ink stains. "And you know what she said?" The man continued, his own voice breaking slightly. She said, "Then let's make right now really, really good." Just like that. This 8-year-old child cutting through all my existential dread with the simplest possible wisdom. We can't control how much time we get, but we can control what we do with the time we have. We can choose to be present, to really see each other, to say the things that matter while we still can. Father Michael felt something cracking open inside him, some hardened place where his disappointment with God had calcified into protective cynicism. This man, this dying father who had every reason to be bitter and afraid, was teaching him something profound about faith. Not faith as belief in divine intervention, but faith as radical presence, as choosing love even when, especially when circumstances are unbearable. The rain had stopped by the time Father Michael emerged from Emma's house 2 hours later, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping. The sky torn open in places where weak sunlight fought through the clouds like hope struggling to break through grief. He sat in his car for a long time, not starting the engine, just processing everything that had transpired in that converted dining room with its makeshift sick room and its small family holding vigil against the inevitable. Emma's father, Tom, Father Michael had learned his name, had asked him to do something unusual as he was leaving. Not to pray for healing, not to offer last rites or speak about salvation, but simply to help Emma understand that her father's death, when it came, wouldn't be a sign of God's absence, but rather an opportunity for a different kind of presence. Help her see, Tom had said, gripping Father Michael's hand with surprising strength for someone so diminished. That faith isn't about getting what we want. It's about finding meaning even when we don't. The request had lodged itself in Father Michael's chest like a stone, heavy and insistent. How could he help Emma understand something he was only beginning to grasp himself? His entire theological education had been built on the foundation of God as active participant in human affairs, a God who answered prayers, who intervened in history, who had plans and purposes that ultimately worked toward good. But sitting with Tom and Emma, watching a father prepare to say goodbye to his daughter far too soon, Father Michael had felt that foundation crumbling beneath him, revealing something both more terrifying and more beautiful underneath. The possibility that God's presence wasn't about control or intervention, but about the courage to remain open to love even when love guaranteed eventual loss. Father Michael started the car and drove, not back to St. Catherine's, but aimlessly through the town, past strip malls and coffee shops, through residential neighborhoods where families were sitting down to dinner, past the high school football field where teenagers practiced in the mud, their shouts carrying on the damp air like assertions of vitality against the dying of the light. He found himself thinking about all the prayers he'd offered over the years, all the petitions he'd made on behalf of parishioners, for healing, for prosperity, for guidance, for rescue. How many of those prayers had gone apparently unanswered? How many people had suffered despite faithful devotion? How many had lost their faith entirely when a miracle they needed never materialized? And yet people kept praying. Emma kept praying, even after God didn't heal her father. Tom kept loving his daughter fiercely, even knowing he'd have to leave her. Sarah kept showing up day after day to provide care, even as exhaustion carved deeper lines in her face. There was something in that persistence, that choosing to remain engaged with life and love despite its fundamental unfairness, that struck Father Michael as more profound than any theological argument about divine providence. He pulled into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town, got out of the car, and walked toward a bench beneath an old oak tree whose leaves had mostly fallen, carpeting the ground in shades of rust and gold. The bench was wet from the rain, but Father Michael sat anyway, feeling the cold seep through his pants as he stared out at the empty playground, swings hanging motionless, a slide gleaming with moisture, a merry-go-round that would spin for any child brave enough to push through the discomfort of a cold, wet day. He thought about Emma pushing that merry-go-round, about how she would run alongside it, building momentum, then leap onto the spinning platform and ride it until physics brought everything back to stillness. That seemed to Father Michael like a perfect metaphor for faith, not the passive waiting for divine intervention, but the active engagement with life's motion, the willingness to jump on and experience the ride, even knowing it would eventually stop. Emma hadn't gotten the miracle she prayed for, but she'd gotten something else, the clarity to see that her father's time was limited and the courage to make that time matter. Father Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number for Bishop Morrison, his superior in the diocese. They hadn't spoken in months, not since Father Michael had started dodging the bishop's calls, afraid that his growing doubts would be visible somehow, that his crisis of faith would be detected and diagnosed as a disease requiring intervention or removal. But sitting there on the wet bench beneath the oak tree, Father Michael felt a strange liberation in his uncertainty, as if acknowledging the depths of his doubt had somehow freed him to begin rebuilding faith on more honest foundations. The bishop answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of warmth and authority that had always made Father Michael feel simultaneously comforted and judged. "Michael, what a pleasant surprise. I was beginning to think you'd taken a vow of technological silence." "Bishop, I need to talk to you about something," Father Michael said, deciding to dispense with pleasantries and get directly to the heart of the matter. "About faith and doubt, and what we're actually promising people when we tell them to pray." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Father Michael could almost hear the bishop's internal recalibration, the shift from casual greeting to pastoral concern. "That sounds serious. Are you all right, Michael?" "I don't know," Father Michael admitted. "I met a child today, Emma. She's 8 years old, and she told me God didn't answer her prayers. Her father is dying of cancer, and despite her faithful petitions, despite her promises and deals and desperate bargaining, he's still dying. And, Bishop, I couldn't give her the standard answers. I couldn't tell her that God has a plan or that her father's death serves some greater purpose. Because standing there, watching her love her father so fiercely knowing she's going to lose him, those answers felt like obscene lies." Bishop Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its administrative quality, becoming something more personal, more human. "Michael, do you remember why you became a priest?" The question caught Father Michael off guard. "Because I wanted to serve God. Because I felt called." "No," the bishop said gently. "I mean the real reason, the specific moment or experience that made you certain this was your path. There's always a story behind the calling." Father Michael closed his eyes, reaching back through the years to a memory he hadn't examined in a long time. He'd been 17, visiting his grandmother in the hospital as she lay dying from complications of diabetes. The priest who'd come to perform last rites had been young, nervous, clearly reading from a script of prescribed rituals. But Father Michael's grandmother had stopped him midway through and asked him to just sit and talk with her about his life, about what made him afraid and what made him hopeful. And the young priest had done so, abandoning the formal prayers to simply be present with a dying woman. And Father Michael had watched his grandmother's fear transform into something like peace, not because she'd been promised heaven, but because someone had truly seen her in that moment, had recognized her humanity even as her body failed. "I wanted to be that kind of presence for people," Father Michael said, the memory surfacing with surprising clarity. "Not someone who just recited prayers, but someone who could sit with people in their worst moments and help them feel less alone." "And have you been doing that?" Bishop Morrison asked. Father Michael thought about the last few years, about how he'd increasingly retreated into the rituals and routines of priesthood, using the structure as a shield against the messiness of actual human suffering. He'd been going through the motions, saying the right words, but he'd stopped really seeing people, stopped allowing their pain to touch him because touching meant feeling, and feeling meant acknowledging that he didn't have answers, that God's silence was real and profound and couldn't be explained away with theology. "No," Father Michael said. "I've been hiding. I've been afraid that if I really looked at people suffering, I'd have to admit that I don't know why God allows it. I'd have to confess that prayer doesn't always work the way we're told it does, that faith doesn't guarantee happy endings, that sometimes people suffer terribly despite being good and faithful and deserving of better. And now," the bishop prompted, "now I think maybe that's exactly what I need to admit," Father Michael said. Emma didn't need me to explain her father's illness or promise her that God would heal him. She needed me to acknowledge that yes, this is unfair and terrible, and God's silence in the face of her prayers is real. And then she needed me to show her that faith isn't about getting the answers we want. It's about choosing to stay present and loving even when the answers don't come. The conversation with Bishop Morrison lasted another 45 minutes. Father Michael, sitting on the wet bench, as evening settled over the park and the temperature dropped enough to make his breath visible. The bishop shared his own moments of doubt, his own encounters with suffering that had shaken his faith foundations, and slowly, Father Michael began to understand that what he'd perceive as a crisis was actually an evolution, a shedding of naive certainties in favor of something more mature and more honest. Faith isn't fragile, Michael, the bishop said toward the end of their call. It doesn't shatter when we question it. In fact, faith that can't withstand doubt isn't really faith at all. It's just wishful thinking dressed in religious language. Real faith is what remains when all the easy answers have been stripped away, when you're standing in the ruins of your certainty and choosing to remain open to mystery, to grace, to the possibility that God's ways of working in the world are stranger and subtler than we've been taught. After they hung up, Father Michael sat for a while longer, watching the last light drain from the sky and the street lights flicker on one by one, electric stars against the gathering darkness. He thought about Emma, wondered if she was sitting with her father now, storing up memories like treasures against the coming winter of his absence. He thought about Tom, using his remaining energy not to rage against fate, but to love his daughter well in whatever time remained. He thought about Sarah, exhausted and terrified, but still showing up, still providing care, still holding the pieces together through sheer determination and grace. And he thought about God, that mysterious presence that seemed to answer prayers selectively at best, that allowed terrible suffering while occasionally intervening in ways that seemed arbitrary. What kind of God was that? Not the God of systematic theology, not the God who could be understood and predicted and bargained with. Perhaps God was less like a benevolent king distributing favors to faithful subjects and more like the ground of being itself, the deep reality that held everything in existence, even as everything in existence struggled and suffered and eventually died. Perhaps God's answer to prayer wasn't intervention, but presence. Not the presence that fixes things, but the presence that remains, that witnesses, that somehow makes it possible to keep loving even when love inevitably leads to loss. Father Michael drove back to St. Catherine's as night fully descended, the church's windows glowing warmly against the darkness like a promise of shelter. He let himself in through the side door and walked through the empty nave, his footsteps echoing in the vaulted space. The altar stood at the far end, and above it, the crucifix that had witnessed countless prayers, countless pleas for intervention, countless moments of faith and doubt played out beneath its unchanging gaze. He knelt before the altar, not with the formality of priestly ritual, but with the desperate simplicity of a man who'd run out of clever prayers and sophisticated theology. "I don't understand you," Father Michael whispered into the silence. "I don't understand why you heal some and not others, why some prayers get answered and others seem to evaporate the moment they're spoken. I don't understand Emma's suffering or Tom's dying or any of the 1,000 terrible things I've witnessed in your name. But I'm here. I'm still here. And I'm asking you to help me be what Emma needs, what Tom needs, what all the broken people who come through these doors need. Not answers, because I don't have those, but presence. Help me be present the way you're present. Even when that presence doesn't fix anything, even when it just means sitting in the darkness together and acknowledging that the darkness is real." The church offered no audible response, no miraculous sign or sudden clarity. But sitting there in the silence, Father Michael felt something shift. Not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle realignment, like a compass needle finding true north after spinning aimlessly. He stood, walked to his office, and pulled out a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, he wrote, "For Emma, thoughts on faith when God doesn't answer." He began to write, not as a priest offering theological instruction, but as a fellow traveler sharing what he'd learned from walking through his own desert of doubt. He wrote about how faith isn't about certainty, but about the courage to remain open when everything in us wants to close. He wrote about how prayer might not change circumstances, but can change us, making us more capable of bearing what must be borne. He wrote about how God's presence is often most real in the spaces where we least expect it. In the hospital room where a father holds his daughter, in the exhausted care of a spouse who keeps showing up day after day, in the child who chooses to make right now really, really good, instead of being consumed by the terrible future approaching. Father Michael wrote for hours, filling page after page with thoughts he hadn't known he possessed until they appeared on paper. Some of it was theology, but most of it was simply testimony. The honest account of a man who'd lost the faith he thought he had and was discovering a different faith in its place, one built not on God's intervention, but on God's companionship in suffering. Not on miracles that change circumstances, but on the miracle of continuing to love when love guarantees pain. When he finally set down his pen, the first light of dawn was coloring the windows, transforming the darkness into shades of gray and pink and gold. Father Michael fell hollowed out, exhausted, but also strangely renewed, as if the act of writing had drained something toxic and replaced it with something cleaner, simpler, more true. He gathered the pages he'd written, read through them once more with a critical eye, and then folded them carefully and placed them in an envelope. On the outside, he wrote simply, "For Emma and her family, with love and honesty." 3 days later, Father Michael returned to Emma's house at Sarah's request. Tom had taken a turn for the worse, his body accelerating toward the inevitable conclusion with a speed that had caught even the hospice nurses off guard. Father Michael arrived to find the house filled with quiet activity, family members speaking in hushed tones, neighbors bringing food that would go largely uneaten, everyone performing the rituals of vigil that humans have enacted since the first death made us aware of our mortality. Emma met him at the door, her face pale and tight with a fear she was trying desperately to control. "He's asking for you," she said. "He's been in and out, but he said your name, said he needed to talk to you before." She couldn't finish the sentence, and Father Michael didn't make her try. Tom's room had been dimmed, the medical equipment casting strange shadows on the walls as various monitors tracked the dwindling rhythms of his life. He looked even more diminished than he had 3 days ago, as if he were becoming translucent, gradually fading from the physical world. But his eyes, when they found Father Michael's, were clear and focused with the peculiar intensity of the dying, that laser-like attention that comes when every moment counts because there are so few moments left. "Father," Tom whispered, and Father Michael had to lean close to hear him. "Did you write something?" "For Emma." Father Michael nodded. "I did. I've been working on it since we talked. It's not everything, but it's what I've learned about faith when prayers don't get answered the way we want." Tom managed a weak smile. "Read it to her. Not now, after. When I'm gone and she's trying to make sense of this. Read it to her then. But right now," he paused, gathering strength for what he wanted to say next. "Right now, I need you to help me do something. I need you to help me show her that faith isn't about me surviving. It's about making this moment, right now, as full of love as possible." Father Michael felt tears pricking his eyes, but forced them back. "What do you need me to do?" "Call her in," Tom said. "And Sarah, and anyone else who's here who wants to come. No more waiting outside, like I'm already gone. I want everyone here, with me, telling stories and laughing and crying and being completely present for whatever time I've left. Can you do that? Can you help make this a celebration instead of just a mourning?" It was such a simple request, and yet it struck Father Michael as profoundly revolutionary. Tom wasn't asking for prayers of healing or last rites or solemn religious rituals. He was asking for the full, messy, beautiful presence of the people he loved, asking to spend his final hours not in quiet resignation, but in radical engagement with life, even as life slipped away. This, Father Michael realized, was the answer to Emma's question about the point of faith when God doesn't intervene. The point was this choosing to love fully in the face of loss, this insistence on presence and connection and meaning even when, especially when, circumstances were at their worst. Father Michael opened the door and called everyone in. Sarah, Emma, Tom's brother and sister, Sarah's parents, the neighbors who'd been hovering uncertainly in the living room. They filled the converted dining room, pulling in chairs, sitting on the floor, surrounding Tom's bed with a circle of warmth and attention. And then, at Tom's direction, they began to tell stories. Memories of camping trips and bad jokes, of the time Tom had tried to fix the sink and flooded the kitchen, of Emma's birth and her first steps and the thousand small moments that constitute a life lived in relationship. Emma sat beside her father, holding his hand, and Father Michael watched as something extraordinary happened. The fear that had been holding her rigid began to loosen, replaced by something else. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of fierce joy in the present moment, a determination to extract every possible ounce of love and connection from the time that remained. She told stories too, her voice gaining strength as she recounted her father's voices for different characters when he read to her, his terrible singing in the car, the way he always made her pancakes on Saturday mornings with chocolate chips arranged in the shape of her initial. And Tom listened, his failing body, somehow, finding the energy to laugh, to add details to the stories, to look at each person in the room with such concentrated love that Father Michael felt like he was witnessing something sacred, not in the formal religious sense, but in the deeper sense of humans transcending their circumstances through the power of presence and connection. This was what it meant to be made in the image of God, Father Michael thought. Not that we could control outcomes or guarantee happy endings, but that we possess the capacity to love radically, to stay present with each other through everything, to find meaning and beauty even in the face of death. Hours passed, the afternoon fading into evening, and gradually Tom's responses became less frequent, his periods of sleep longer. But even in unconsciousness, he was surrounded by the physical presence of his people, their voices creating a cocoon of love around him. Sarah sat on the bed, Emma curled against her father, and Father Michael stood at the periphery, bearing witness to the slow transition from life to death, from presence to absence to a different kind of presence. Around midnight, Tom opened his eyes one last time, his gaze finding Emma. "I love you, butterfly," he whispered. "Always. Forever. No matter what." And Emma, with a maturity that broke Father Michael's heart, whispered back, "I love you too, Daddy. Thank you for making right now really, really good." Tom smiled, an expression of such peace and completion that it seemed to illuminate his face from within, and then he closed his eyes and his breathing gradually slowed, each breath coming further apart, until finally it stopped altogether and the monitors began their flatline song, and everyone in the room collectively held their breath, as if they could somehow hold back the tide of death through sheer force of will. But they couldn't, of course. Death came, as it always does, indifferent to prayers and pleas and the desperate love of those left behind. Tom was gone, and the room that had been so full of his presence suddenly contained only his absence, a vacuum that threatened to collapse everything inward. Sarah began to cry, deep racking sobs that seemed to come from the core of her being, and Emma held her mother while crying herself. And Father Michael found himself crying too, tears streaming down his face for a man he'd barely known, but who had somehow taught him more about faith in a few days than seminary had taught him in years. The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Catherine's, the church filled beyond capacity with people whose lives Tom had touched, co-workers and neighbors, parents of Emma's friends, people who'd known Tom as a little league coach or a helpful presence in the community. Father Michael stood at the altar and looked out at the sea of faces, all gathered to bear witness to the significance of one man's life and the hole his death had torn in the fabric of their small world. But instead of delivering the standard funeral homily about eternal life and divine plans and the comfort of heaven, Father Michael did something different. He called Emma forward and asked her if she would share something with the congregation. She looked terrified for a moment. This small 8-year-old girl, suddenly the center of attention in a church full of grieving adults. But then she nodded and walked to the front, and Father Michael handed her the pages he'd written, the thoughts on faith when God doesn't answer. Emma's voice was thin at first, barely audible, but as she read, it grew stronger, filling the church with words about doubt and presence and the courage to love when love guarantees loss. She read about how her father's death wasn't a sign of God's absence, but a testament to what it means to be fully human, to know that life is temporary and to choose engagement over retreat, love over fear, presence over protection. She read about how faith isn't about getting what we want from God, but about becoming people capable of bearing what must be borne people who can sit with suffering without trying to explain it away, people who can hold each other in the darkness and somehow, mysteriously, find that the darkness itself becomes a kind of communion. When she finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. People weren't crying just from grief, though grief was certainly present, but from something else, recognition, perhaps, of truth that's usually kept hidden beneath layers of religious comfort and social nicety. Emma had given voice to what everyone felt but rarely admitted, that God's silence is real, that suffering often makes no sense, that death comes for everyone regardless of faith or goodness or the fervent prayers of those who love us. But she'd also given voice to the other truth, the harder truth, that we can choose to remain open anyway, to love anyway, to find meaning anyway, and that this choosing is itself a kind of miracle, perhaps the only miracle that really matters. After the service, people came to Father Michael with something he'd rarely encountered in his years of ministry: honest gratitude mixed with honest doubt. They thanked him for not offering easy answers, for acknowledging the difficulty of faith in the face of real suffering, for creating space where doubt and belief could coexist without contradiction. One woman, elderly and sharp-eyed, gripped his hand and said, "That's the first honest sermon I've heard in this church in 30 years. Don't stop now." In the weeks that followed, something shifted at St. Catherine's. People began coming to Father Michael not with the expectation that he would fix their problems through prayer or provide theological explanations for their suffering, but simply to be heard, to have their doubt and pain acknowledged as valid responses to a world that often seems indifferent to human hopes. Father Michael found himself sitting with people in their mess, abandoning the impulse to rush toward resolution or comfort, learning instead to simply be present with whatever they were experiencing. Emma came to the church every Sunday, sitting in the front pew where she could see Father Michael clearly. Sometimes she came with her mother, sometimes with her grandparents, but she always came, and after each service, she would wait to talk with him about her father, about her ongoing struggles with prayer and faith, about her evolving understanding of what it meant to believe in God who didn't always intervene, but who was somehow still present in the spaces between answers. One Sunday, about 2 months after Tom's death, Emma asked Father Michael a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Do you think my dad can see me now? From heaven or wherever?" Father Michael could have given her the standard answer about eternal life and the communion of saints, the reassuring promise that death doesn't really separate us from those we love. But thinking about everything Tom had taught him, everything Emma had taught him, he chose honesty instead. "I don't know," he said. "I like to believe he can. I like to think that love is stronger than death, that the bond between you and your father survives even physical separation. But I can't prove it. I can't give you certainty." Emma nodded slowly, and Father Michael braced himself for disappointment or anger. But instead, she said something that made him realize how much she'd grown in the crucible of her father's illness and death. "That's okay. I think maybe faith is better without certainty. Because if we knew for sure, it wouldn't really be faith, would it? It would just be knowledge. And knowledge is easier, but faith, real faith, that's choosing to hope and love even when you can't be certain of the outcome. That's what Dad did. He chose to love me completely even knowing he'd have to leave me. And I can choose to believe he's still with me somehow, even if I can't prove it." Father Michael stared at this 8-year-old theologian, this small prophet who'd been forced to understand things most adults spend lifetimes avoiding, and felt a wave of something he could only describe as grace. Not the grace that fixes things or explains suffering or provides comfortable certainties, but the grace that shows up in the form of a child's hard-won wisdom, offering perspective that transforms how we see everything. 6 months after Tom's death, St. Catherine's started a support group for people grappling with doubt and difficult questions about faith. Father Michael facilitated, but mostly he just created space for people to be honest about their struggles without fear of judgment or correction. The group grew quickly, filling the church basement every Thursday evening with people who'd been carrying private doubts for years, grateful to finally have permission to voice their questions. They talked about prayers that went unanswered, about suffering that made no sense, about the gap between what they'd been taught to believe and what their lived experience told them was true. And slowly, collectively, they began to build a different kind of faith, one that could hold doubt and belief simultaneously, one that didn't require certainty to sustain hope, one that found God, not in miraculous interventions, but in the courage to remain present and loving even when presence and love guaranteed pain. Emma came to the group sometimes, sitting quietly and listening to adults voice versions of the same struggle she'd experienced. And sometimes, when someone shared a story about feeling abandoned by God, she would speak up with her childlike directness. Maybe God didn't leave. Maybe God just doesn't work the way we think God works. Maybe God is in the staying, not the fixing. And the adults would fall silent, struck by the wisdom coming from this small person who'd learned through suffering what many of them were still trying to understand. Father Michael watched it all unfold. The transformation of his church from a place of certainty and comfort to a place of honest questioning and genuine community, and marveled at how Tom's death had somehow become a catalyst for resurrection. Not the magical kind, where bodies rise from graves, but the more subtle kind where rigid faith dies and something more flexible and resilient grows in its place. Tom hadn't gotten the miracle Emma prayed for, but his life and death had sparked something miraculous nonetheless. A community learning to be present with each other's pain, to love without the guarantee of happy endings, to find God in the very places they'd been taught God was absent. On the first anniversary of Tom's death, Emma asked if she could say something during the Sunday service. Father Michael agreed, and when the time came, Emma stood at the front of the church, taller now, older in ways that had nothing to do with the single year that had passed, and spoke directly to the congregation. A year ago, I told Father Michael that God didn't answer my prayers. And that was true. God didn't heal my dad. But this year I've learned something. God did answer, just not with words or miracles or any of the things I was looking for. God answered by giving me the time I had with my dad. God answered by helping me be brave enough to really be present with him, to say everything that mattered while I still could. God answered by putting people around me. People like Father Michael and all of you who didn't try to fix my pain, but just sat with me in it and helped me keep going. That's not the answer I wanted, but maybe it's the answer I needed. The church was absolutely silent as Emma returned to her pew, and Father Michael saw in that silence not emptiness but fullness, the kind of silence that happens when truth lands so precisely that no response is adequate, when the only thing left to do is sit with what's been said and let it rearrange your understanding from the inside out. Emma had restored faith, not by providing certainty or proof of divine intervention, but by demonstrating what faith looked like when it had been tested by fire and emerged transformed, not as blind belief, but as eyes-wide-open commitment to love and presence and meaning even in the face of inevitable loss.